I Want You had so many different incarnations. I think it was a demo called Today, a Bad Day. And there was just something in the sound of that demo that was worth keeping. The songwriting process for the first Savage Garden record was such a long period that I guess we revisited that original demo maybe a year later. I guess that idea of the chorus, it was really a background vocal. There was no lyric. It was just, I think I was singing something like, ooh, ah, ooh, ah, ooh, ah, ooh, ah, something like that. And then that became a chorus. I remember being very precious about lyrics and very overly detailed. And one of the brilliant things that Daniel does is he sees the forest for the trees. And he just said to me, what about something really simple? Why don't you just have a really simple chorus? And that's where the lyric, I Want You, came from. But what remained, I guess, was those really strange lyrics, which were really about having a dream, about falling in love in a dream and waking up the next day and missing the subject of the dream. So the verses are very surreal and trippy, and the chorus is really, really simple. And years later, I guess, by the time it was recorded with Charles Fisher, it sounded like a smash hit single when it was finished. I remember feeling that in the room. I think there are so many things about songs that make the general public wake up and take a listen, and none of them are really scientific. What I think is unique about I Want You is there are 3 or 4 sort of pieces of ear candy in there. One of them is the line "sweet like a cherry cola," which most people mistakenly thought I said "sweet like a cherry cola." Again, I guess I was just trying to be clever. I was stuttering on the word cherry. The truth about that lyric is the first time I ever went to the United States, and this was pre-internet, pre-globalization, there were foods and candies and just soft drinks and products that we never had in Australia. And I tried Dr. Pepper, and I didn't know what flavor it was, and I thought it was cherry. I didn't want to plug Coca-Cola, so I wrote this lyric, you know, you curl up in the base of my spine, sweet like a cherry cola. And that stuck out. I remember that's what Rosie O'Donnell plugged into when the song was leaked to American radio. We didn't even have a record deal at the time, but a gentleman by the name of Guy Sapolian, who is a radio programmer for a US station, had been in Australia, heard the song on the radio, took it back, gave digital copy, like DAT copies, to various DJs to test it out. And Rosie O'Donnell heard the song, and she would play it on her talk show every day for about 3 seconds. And she'd say, "Who is this band? I want this band on my show." You know, and she called it the Chicka Cherry Cola song, and I guess it was coined as that. I don't know, there are a lot of crazy sounds and you know, this combination, I guess, of these surreal lyrics and this incredibly infectious and layered musical background that was, you know, it reminded me, I guess, of things like ELO. The world thought it sounded like Roxette. I don't know. It was a crazy collision of all these wonderful, happy accidents that made people pay attention.
I felt that it was potentially a hit when I heard this song. It was one of the most, I guess, well-crafted pop songs that both Darren and I had ever written. And Charles Fisher, who was the producer, you know, put a special pop touch on that whole thing, and then finished off with a fantastic mix by a gentleman named Chris Lord-Alge at John Farnham's studio in Melbourne at that time. And just a pop hit, it sounded like to me. Look, I think it's very similar to a rap song where you've got a very fast, rhythmic, vocal, percussive-like verse, and then it breaks into a somewhat melodic, open-ended melody. And I Want You does that. And it's funny, it was easier for Darren to sing the faster the tempo was because he didn't have to hold his breath so long, which was quite ironic because it's already a very fast vocally song. And the fact that he was pushing it to go faster because it made it easier for him was, it's all part of that particular magic around that song. The song I Want You, when we played it in the studio in Melbourne, after it had been mixed, they'd spent all day on the mix, and they played it as loud as they could through the biggest system in the studio. And it was that moment where you felt it and heard it, and everything seemed to have all come together on that particular song. And it was probably then, no one knew who we were at this point, you have to remember, but it was at that point then when I saw myself being able to perform to, hundreds, thousands, if not tens of thousands of people at that particular time, because of how powerful this song was from my point of view.
Choosing a single is never something I love to do, and I don't think it's my strong suit. I Want You was the first song from the album, and I wasn't sure I wanted that to be the first single. I was concerned it was disposable, and I think both Daniel and I really wanted to create the impression that we were really serious songwriters. It was an era where 5 minutes before we arrived, we could not get signed. Everything was grunge or it was sort of alterna pop. So it was either coming off the back of Nirvana, so you had bands like Pearl Jam, or you had, more accessible modern rock, or you had these really amazing female performers. I mean, Alanis Morissette springs to mind, where people were experimenting with loops, but it was about female empowerment, and it was still angry. Pop music was a filthy word. By the time Savage Garden arrived with I Want You, so did Max Martin. So did the pop explosion in the US. Britney Spears, the Backstreet Boys. That was where we were competing against, and that was in many ways what we were afraid of being confused for. So To the Moon and Back as a second single was a very strategic choice. It was an epic song. It was probably some of our most classic songwriting. It featured this extended orchestral coda at the end that we poured over for months. I was a huge Bjork fan, and I always loved songs that kind of came back for a bit of a revamp. So from a structural point of view, it was a much different song. At the same time, we were worried that it might be too serious. I could never tell if that song was a hit or not. And I think in Australia, it was our first ever number one, and it's probably the most played song we had in Australia. And I know in the UK, it's a very identifiable song. And whenever people meet me, honestly, that's the song they remember and sing to me. I guess it carried a weight to it and maybe a maturity that we didn't really have at that time, but were hoping to be.
What I wanted to create was, I wanted this band or this duo to be taken seriously as well as enjoyed on the lighter side of things. So I Want You was one of those very instant pop hits that just, came straight through the brackets of radio and stood out to everyone. But I found To the Moon and Back, it had a lot more substance, and it was a lot more of a deeper sort of song, and beautifully, lyrically, creatively put together from Darren's point of view. And I wanted people to understand that, yes, this is a pop band, but it was an intellectual pop band, if that makes any sense. Something that, yes, we have pop melodies, yes, we have pop progressions, but we're saying something lyrically here that's a little bit more clever than Ooh, I Want You. And To the Moon and Back fulfilled that perfect place for that song at that time. I actually had that whole song written from start to finish before Darren had even put a lyric on it or a melody on it. A lot of the melody was actually already in the music, and it was a turning point for me in my late teenage years because, like a lot of Australians, I was up the pub, Friday night. I was maybe 18, 19, and my brothers were up there, and I'm like, you know what? I don't belong in this pub. It was the crappiest pub in Brisbane, and I knew that I just didn't belong there anymore. So I went, you know what, I'm going home. It was like maybe 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, which was early to leave a pub in any time in Australia. And I walked home. It was a couple of kilometres, and I got home and I started composing what ultimately became the whole complete To the Moon and Back, from the start of the intro to the guitars to the chorus to the little melodies in there to this orchestral piano string ending. And I remember kind of going, this is my ticket that's going to stop me having to go back to that pub and drink. And it's a strange metaphor for me, but that song saved me as well as when Darren contributed his lyrical story to it, it floored me even more so because it was a very personal subject for him about a friend of his that probably wasn't that dissimilar to me in the sense that they were lost. And I think I found myself with this particular song, and I think once Darren contributed the lyrics, a lot of listeners have found themselves through this song, and I think it means probably the most to me out of all of the songs that I've ever written.
Truly, Madly, Deeply changed our lives. It continues to change my life. It continues to pay my bills. It was such a sincere love song. I wrote it for my wife. I was really not prepared, I think, for the disconnect and the disconnection from family and relationships and friendships that recording an album required. We moved to Sydney for almost 8 months, and I'd never lived anywhere other than Brisbane, Australia, my whole life. I'd never been away from my family for as long as we were. I was dead broke. At the time, I'd just come out of teachers' college, which I'd done to, really satisfy my father, who at the time when I told him I was going to be a rock star, told me I was going to end up living in the gutter. So, to appease him, I went back to university. I had studied all sorts of things. I was supposed to study drama. I spent some time as a journalist. I did this teaching degree thinking I'd never have to use it. And then suddenly we didn't have any money. I'm recording an album, and my wife at that time, we were married by the time the album was recording, and she was supporting both of us, and I was earning nothing. And I was incredibly lonely. And the song in its demo stage, it's so funny. The song in the demo stage was called Magical Kisses. And it's exactly the same as the song you know today, except that the verses are identical, but the chorus was it was these lyrics about how I was going to, I don't know, I plant some magical seed. I don't know what I was thinking, but there was a nugget of a fantastic song in there. And when we took it to Charles Fisher, this is the brilliance of someone like Charles, and having a third set of ears. He knew that there was a hit there, but it just wasn't finished. And so at the end of that really long period of recording the album, and I'm really missing my family and really feeling isolated, and truthfully the stress of Daniel and I on that relationship where you took these two very young men, put them in a one-bedroom apartment for 8 months with no money. That chorus of the song was rewritten the night before I sang it. I went and sat in a restaurant in King's Cross on my own. I think it was called the Bayswater Brasserie at the time. And I wrote, I want to stand with you on a mountain. I want to bathe with you in the sea. I want to lay like this forever until the sky falls down on me. And I wrote the melody in my head because it was a completely different chorus previously. And I went into the studio the next day. I was recording my own vocals. Charles was in another room, and I said, I've got this idea for that song. Let me just try something. Recorded it, and I think he immediately said, that's a #1 single.
Truly, Madly, Deeply was a song that took on a second life during the recording process. It actually never started out as the song called Truly, Madly, Deeply. It was a song called Magical Kisses. And this is one of those days where Darren and I's relationship was being a little bit tested on a creative level. And I remember kind of nearly begging with Darren to change the title of this song and to actually rework and look at the chorus, because for me at that time, it just didn't sit right with the sound of what Savage Garden was becoming. And we had this very pop song with a very pop chorus called Magical Kisses. So it didn't sit right for me, and Darren, God bless him, was understanding enough to rework the chorus, and he sat down and said, what about this? And he came up with this, I want to bathe with you in a sea, I want to stand with you on a mountain. And I'm just like, wow, whatever that was sounded like poetry. So yes, let's do this. That's a great chorus. And thus it ended up getting finished the way it is now in the studio, literally probably in the last week, maybe last 2 weeks of our 10-month recording process. I knew that song, once it was successful and it went to number one in those countries, I was so blessed to think that something that I've created went to number one around the world and, ultimately gave me my security that I can now give my children. A couple of people have said to me, can you believe, you've got a house out of that song? And I went, well, no, it's very hard to believe, but the only two people in this whole planet that could have written that particular song was Darren and myself. There was nobody else that wrote that song, and it was that particular song that went to number one in those countries. So I guess, in that sense, Darren and I do deserve our rewards for doing something that nobody else could do, and that was to create that particular song.
Break Me, Shake Me to this day is such a fun conversation with my best friend Nat from school. Obviously, I don't live in Australia anymore, but Nat is my friend I met in grade 3. She was a Madonna fan and I was a Michael Jackson fan. And then through high school, she used to look like Madonna. I was obsessed with voguing. So, naturally, we were just very, very close friends. She's always been there for me. And like all good friends, boy, have we had fights. And Break Me, Shake Me is about one of our fights. I think a great thing about the way Savage Garden was introduced to the world was everyone knew very quickly from the second single, you were not going to be able to say what the sound of this band was. Our fourth single was a rock song, Break Me, Shake Me. It is just bass, drums and guitar and a couple of finger clicks. It's angry. It's, to this day, one of my favorite songs to perform live. As a solo artist, I have changed that song every single tour. Sometimes I would mash it up with a bit of Michael Jackson, which was the inspiration, I think, for some of my vocals in that song. Sometimes it was mashed up with 9 Inch Nails because it could get that angry. Sometimes it was a Depeche Mode song. Sometimes it was U2. Sometimes it was Lenny Kravitz. But always at the heart of that song is just a very simple rock and roll song.
Break Me, Shake Me was inspired by a combination of the guitarist Steve Stevens, who was Billy Idol's guitarist, and Michael Jackson. And I think at that time in our lives when we were writing, I came from 80s rock music. So I was all about 80s rock, big hair, big guitars. I don't tell too many people that nowadays, but it does make up a small part of me. And Darren was very, very much into the Michael Jackson, superstardom of the 80s. And I think when Darren and I were our true selves, Michael Jackson would come out of him and some 80s rock guitarists would come out of me. And thus we got Break Me, Shake Me out of it. But the reality is it's a rock song. And when we performed it live, we would keep it as a rock song. It was always on the front foot. It was always kind of loud, noisy, and that was just that song. It needed to be on the record as a rock song. Very much so. A lot of our songs were. So I think I remember writing the bass line, and then I remember looking around at Darren, and he's doing these finger snaps like Michael Jackson, and he would lift up his shoulders, every time he would snap, and I'd go, oh my God, he's like a little Michael Jackson here, and the song just started to create itself.
I'm not going to lie, Universe is not one of my favourite songs, but it was written in the front room of the Daniel Jones family house. Daniel was very lucky that he had a brother, and a father and a mother who were all very, very supportive of their son's desire to be musicians. All 3 boys in the Jones family were great musicians. Universe was an attempt really to write something vaguely R&B. I think there's a rap by Daniel, which is hilarious. He's only appeared on our music twice. He has a speaking part in To the Moon and Back where he says 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And he does that little rap in the middle of the oh so sexy Universe. Charles Fisher absolutely polished that song, and I have a soft spot for it, but I would say it's probably the least confidently individual sound on the record. It was definitely me, not quite sure who I was, secretly wishing I was a Jackson, but I've just realised I'm not. I grew up with a really unique influence from my aunt Jenny, my sister Tracy, and my mum, who were all huge Motown fans. I remember my mum, and she knows this story, I tell it all the time, but she lovingly broke a copy of Someday We'll Be Together by Diana Ross and the Supremes over my head because I scratched it. I played that record so much. When everyone else was listening to Duran Duran and Cyndi Lauper and new wave pop, I was listening to Motown records. I was listening to Marvin Gaye, The Temptations. I was understanding who Smokey Robinson was. And that helped me, I think, to develop a falsetto voice. A lot of the time I was imitating these artists and I couldn't sing. I was a male and a lot of them were females, and so, or had high voices like Smokey Robinson. And so I would just imitate them, not understanding at all what I was doing, and that was called falsetto. Even Michael Jackson records like Human Nature, I just hit the notes. I didn't understand how or why. But that influence was ingrained in me. And I think Universe was really the first time I sort of let that stuff out. In my mind, I guess I thought I was singing Sexual Healing, or The Tears of a Clown or something. But it was definitely an homage to, or maybe an unconscious release of some of those crooners that I'd listened to from the Motown era.
Universe was a little bit of a, we're not 100% sure who we are, so let's have a go at writing this R&B like sultry, sexual, beautiful song that you would want to make love to. And I think it was a little bit of Darren's R&B flavour that he has, and then it was probably fused with my English big sweep synthesizers and, kind of ambient, seductive feel. A lot of these were written in the bedroom of my parents' house. It was really a song that was a bit of an experiment because we were trying to find out exactly who Savage Garden were at that time, because it was undiscovered. It was a bit like scratching off a prize. You're not sure what's underneath it until you've actually got it all off, and that's part of the process of finding yourself as an artist.
All Around Me really was an excuse for me to rap. I was a huge fan of Madonna's Vogue. I was a huge Pet Shop Boys fan. I always loved it when there was a 4 on the floor drum beat, and I was constantly dragging Daniel towards synthesizers and electronics and my new wave heart. The second Savage Garden album was almost called Electronic Heartbeat because I desperately wanted to make, the album with William Orbit. I mean, that's where my head was going. Whereas Daniel, his influences were much more, he loved, for example, Seal was one of his favorite artists. So when he was listening to our music, his influences were much more grounded and classic in their sound. And my sounds were always much more experimental and eclectic. Had either of us won that A&R war, the band would never have been successful, but it was the marriage of those two that always worked. So All Around Me, I think, is probably the most Darren-sounding song on the first record, and Carry On Dancing is another example of that, where these very theatrical, big pop productions. I think listening to a lot of disco, I think Diana Ross disco and anything produced by Nile Rodgers was a huge influence for me. Love Hangover, if you listen to the 12-inch mix of that song. Donna Summer, I Feel Love. Those records were things that influenced me. Now, you put those through a filter of someone like Daniel, who's grown up with Oz Rock, who really is not funky at all. I don't know if I'm funky in the least, but Daniel is even less funky than I am. It was interesting. I think what resulted was a sort of a Hall & Oates version of what funk or soul would be, as opposed to, Prince. But that was the influence there.
All Around Me was an experiment in the studio. I wanted it to sound, believe it or not, okay, this is not even going to make sense, but it was actually written from my point of view about Meg Ryan's personality. When Meg Ryan was a big movie actress in the early 90s, mid-90s, there was some very quirky behaviours of her in the movie. It was a bit of a tragic movie called When a Man Loves a Woman, and it was about her being a drunk. And she had this over-the-top kind of personality, a little bit like my wife nowadays, but my wife is beautiful. So it just had this fun bubbliness about it, and I think musically I wanted to capture that bubbliness if that makes sense. Everyone knows a bubbly girl. This music was to try and grab that bubbliness. Firstly, All Around Me was a song that was kind of created for fun. But as far as radio in Australia and what they did for Savage Garden, it was unspeakable. Like the amount of support that we had from all the networks in Australia, so many stations across that whole entire country, they all jumped behind us and supported our music, which, that goes a long way. And without them, we would never, ever be where we are today, talking about a legacy of all these songs. So, yeah, unbelievable support from Australia as far as radio.
There's a really fascinating story with Santa Monica because it was never intended to be on the album. John Woodruff had promised us that he was going to fly us to London and he was going to let us attend the mix of our first album. So what did Darren Hayes do? I spent 6 months learning everything I could about London. I was obsessed. And then I got a call one day from John and he said, look, we're not going to have the budget to send you guys, but they'll be able to send you through mixes. Well, I flipped out. I gave John this impassioned speech that he and I laugh about to this day. I said, John Woodruff, do you think that Madonna or Prince or Michael Jackson or Bono would just let someone send them a mix of their album? I'm sure that they're at the mix. And John told me to not be so effing precious and he hung up on me. And I went back inside to my family and I said, I've either destroyed my career or I've won, and I won. The whole mix was then changed to Melbourne so that we could be in attendance, and the mix engineer was flown to Australia, and I'm so, so grateful for that. Because we weren't travelling to London or anywhere overseas, I'd been saving up money and my hopes and dreams to be in another culture. So before the album was mixed, I went to the bank. I got my first ever credit card. I managed to get $1,000 credit, and my wife and I at the time went to LA for our first ever trip overseas. We had a budget of $40 a day for everything. We still have a diary somewhere of our budget for that trip. And by the time we got to the end of the trip, we were in Santa Monica for 2 days, somewhere that I'd never thought about going, but the travel agent said, it's nice, you might like it. Well, I fell in love with it. And I remember walking around the 3rd Street Promenade, and I went home and I wrote these lyrics to this song. And we recorded it in a demo studio. Daniel's brother did the mix of it, presented it to Roadshow, and someone in the marketing department heard it and said, this is such a great song, it should be on the album, and it was striped on at the end. So it's now one of my favourite songs we've ever written, and it's a fan favourite, and the Japanese released it as a single.
Very good question. It was actually Darren's obsession with America, including Disneyland, everything that was American at the time. He was obsessed with it. And I think, given fairness, Madonna, Michael Jackson, Prince, all of his favourite artists were all from America and somewhat Disneyland, if that makes sense. So Darren was just obsessed with the whole part of America, and I think when he came back from walking around Santa Monica, I think it must have struck a real lyrical chord with him to write this particular storyline about the city and the streets and the people. One of my favourite songs, actually. Very, very great song. And my brother, Oliver Jones, actually helped me record and mix it in Brisbane once Darren had put the vocal down. So, it was just one of those magical songs that kind of came out of nowhere but was obviously living inside of Darren's heart lyrically. I brought 4 very simple chords, like the Beatles. The Beatles have 4 very simple chords. I brought the feeling to it. I brought the walkie, the slow pace, stroll, walk along the promenade type,
I always had an obsession with new wave and big pop stars, and even though I didn't listen to Duran Duran really as a fan as a kid, when the 90s happened, I started the 80s obsession. I was a hipster retroist from the very beginning, and I really, I missed the new wave era. I was into Michael. I wasn't into Duran. I was into George Michael. I wasn't into Morrissey. And so there was definitely a sort of a camp theatrical nature to the whole movement that I didn't experience. And I mined very heavily, I think, as a style. Daniel definitely, loved Duran, and I think Tears of Pearls was a very definite and obvious attempt on our part to really be camp, be theatrical, create this almost bourgeois sound. There are many songs in my career that have really attempted to do this. On the first Savage Garden record, Carry On Dancing is the opening to that record in Australia. For that reason, I wanted to invite people into a very, almost into like a neon ballroom, and I wanted this vision of grandiose and theatricality, and Tears of Pearls does that. It was incredible live. I remember we worked with a costume designer specifically for me and that song, and I wore this really long trench coat. I think at the time I was obsessed with vampires. The name of the band came from Anne Rice's The Vampire Chronicles, and I was obsessed with the goth in me. Did I mention that I was obsessed with being a goth? And the jacket that I had, the trench, it had these incredible splits in it, so that on that drum, the tom break in just before the chorus, I would spin and the strobes would go off and the lighting design would go insane. And it was all designed to do something visually and theatrically with that song. So I think there were times when Daniel and I both thought in the recording process and the writing process of what we would need in our live set. And Tears of Pearls was a sort of song we thought we could open a show with this. And I think sometimes I certainly have as a solo artist, and I think it was often our second song live. So it was a definite choice to have something that would serve visuals, it would serve a set list, it would do something to the energy of a crowd.
I remember feeling like I was writing a song that Darren wanted to write. And that happened from time to time with the pair of us. I would give him some lyrical suggestions and say, look, I really want to write a song about this or a song about that. And I think Tears of Pearls for me was a song that I was writing because he was asking me to write that type of song. Nearly literally, like kind of going, can you do this beat? Can you do this? What about down limp, down limp? And I was literally kind of carving it out in front of him going, is this what you mean? Is this what you mean? So I never really had a super personal connection with Tears of Pearls, although the connection I have with it was that it was something that I was doing selflessly for Darren because Darren was wanting to hear it and he couldn't play an instrument, so I was more than willing to use whatever I could do to give him that.
The Animal song was an interim song. Prior to writing the Animal song, Savage Garden went from being nothing to selling 10 million albums, having a number one single, touring the world. I left Australia. I came out to my family and friends. I divorced my wife. I lived in New York City. I was clinically depressed but didn't know it. It was one of the most miserable times of my life. I had no idea what was going to happen to me or the band. Daniel and I lived in two separate parts of the world. Our creative relationship was extremely separate. And the Animal song was subconsciously, I think, a desire to escape for me. I really wanted there to be, tropical islands and palm trees and happiness and joy because I was so sad in my personal life. And then Disney came along, and so did another major film company, and they gave us this opportunity to write a song for a film. So we watched two films. We watched The Other Sister starring Juliette Lewis and Giovanni Ribisi. And it was a story about two, I guess, autistic people who were finally able to live independently of their parents, but emotionally perhaps not ready for a relationship. The film really touched me and I loved it. And we saw this other little film that I thought was never going to be a hit. It was starring Julia Roberts and Richard Gere called Runaway Bride. And I thought that thing's never going to be a hit. So we wrote a song for the film that was a flop, and we wrote it for Disney, and we catered the lyrics to fit this extraordinary love story in the film. No one went to see the movie, and in America, no one really played the song, but for the love of God, I'm so glad that in Australia and Canada and the UK, that song was a big hit, and it was huge live, and the biggest gift that song gave me was it introduced me to San Francisco. We had the opportunity to go to San Francisco to meet Walter Afanasieff. At that time, he had been most famous for working with Mariah Carey, Whitney Houston, Michael Bolton, a lot of artists that I'm honest that I had never listened to and never been inspired by. And I was not feeling Walter as a producer. I said to the record company I thought it was too conservative. I was going to go off and make this strange record with Daniel called Electronic Heartbeat, and we're going to work with William Orbit and Mark Stent and all these different people. I went there under sufferance. I fell in love with San Francisco. Walter is to this day one of my dearest friends in the business. I love him so, so much. He was a huge part of why our second record was just as strong as our first record, and he held a band together when we were really kind of drifting apart. It changed my whole life.
The Animal song was written for one purpose, and that was a movie called The Other Sister. And it was a transitional song that allowed us to have a presence in the market between album one and the second album that we were currently recording and writing at that particular time. So I remember the Animal song just having a good feel about it, really large drums, and it was uplifting. It made you not worry about all your little problems that, the first world problems that we all have. And it was like kind of a polite reality check, and it worked well in relevance to the film that it was written for. But I didn't necessarily think it was a hit. I just knew that it was an upbeat, fun song that made you feel good. Rhythmically, it's funny, the strangest songs influenced me. It was a Hoodoo Gurus song called Like Wow Wipeout. Actually inspired me on a musical front to come up with the drum intro for the Animal song. It's never going to be a Hoodoo Gurus song, but it's going to be ultimately a Savage Garden song when both Darren and I contribute what we contribute to it. So, yeah, it's funny where songs actually come from initially and then where they end up. Radio are always going to love a song that the listener feels good to listen to it. And I think the Animal song was one of those songs that people just felt good. So I think radio definitely helped that song become a little bit more of a staple for Savage Garden in Australia, more so than anywhere in the world, to be honest. I think because it wasn't a straight up and down pop hit, I think that all it really got noticed for was being a song in the film, and it wasn't a very, very long piece of audio in that film either. So we did it because we were asked to do it and because we enjoyed the process of doing it, but in reality, it got a little unnoticed at that time.
I Knew I Loved You was the second time Savage Garden had a Billboard #1 single, and it has all these impressive statistics. Truly, Madly, Deeply and I Knew I Loved You are the #1 and #2 most played songs consecutively for their amount of time on the chart, on the US Billboard AC charts. Like, it's a crazy feat. And you can pick any ballad, More Than a Woman, you could pick Unchained Melody, any of them. I can't believe this, but those two songs by those two boys from Brisbane, Australia, actually stayed for the most consecutive weeks on the Billboard AC Adult Contemporary charts for the longest since charts began. Now, when I tell you how that song began, will shock you because it wasn't on Affirmation, the album. We had finished the album. We presented it to Sony Music, Columbia Records, very proudly. And Donnie Ienner, the president of Columbia Records, heard the album and he just sent one message back. He said, "Great album, fantastic songwriting. Overall, it's a better album than your first album, but there's no hit. There's no Truly, Madly, Deeply. And if you don't have one, it's probably not going to sell very many copies." I was furious. There was no Truly, Madly, Deeply, and he wanted one. And then we went into Walter's guest pool room, I think it was, or wherever a piano was set up for us when we wanted to be away from everyone. And we said, let's write the most cynical, generic, calculating love song we possibly can that they'll hate, and let's just do it. Let's just do it despite them and say, here you go. And 5 minutes into writing that, we stumbled upon the most beautiful and sincere love song, and I started crying. It was that touching. I wasn't in love. I was, in fact, wounded by love. I didn't think I was ever going to end up with anyone again in my life. I hated love. On this album, there were songs like Gunning Down Romance. So the idea of writing a sequel to Truly Madly Deeply was for me preposterous. And yet, out of my pain came this true self, this song that was essentially saying, I know that you're out there one day. I look back now that I'm with Richard and I realize it was about him and I just hadn't met him yet. So Daniel and I wrote a very quick piano vocal version of it, went back into the studio, sold it to Walter by just playing it to him, and he flipped out and said, this is extraordinary. We recorded it. We sent it to Donny Ienner with one fax back and we said, there's your number one hit. And he said, thank you. And it was.
Interesting. I Knew I Love You was nearly a reaction from Darren that was a reaction to a reaction. And I'll give you the story in short. We had delivered the album, the second album, finished to the record company. And Donny Ienner, who was the president at the time of Columbia Records, had said, look, it's great, there's some great songs on it, but I don't hear the Truly Madly Deeply. Well, you're not going to hear a second Truly Madly Deeply because there is only one Truly Madly Deeply. That was the reality. And that was what Darren replied, and we all understood that and we all agreed. But we also knew what he was saying. And what he was saying was that there isn't a number one ballad on the second record. Now, that's a tall order for any artist to go and do a number one ballad so that we've got a hit for the second record. That's a massive ask. However, they in a slightly offensive way, both Darren and I were challenged to do that. So we literally sat down together and we had the chorus written within the first 5 minutes. And I had goosebumps sticking up on my arms. And I went, Darren, that's it. That's all you need to do. That's it. That's what they want. And he goes, okay, well, let's just give it to them then. And it did it in an amazing songsmith approach and such a clever songwriter in that regard. I give Darren a lot of credit for that song. He just literally did it as a reaction to a reaction. We wrote it at Wally World Studios, which is Walter Afanasieff Studios in San Rafael, San Francisco. And it was a beautiful house that we were staying in at the time, and we just sat down at one of his, very expensive Steinway pianos, and we both knew what the request was. Darren was perhaps a little bit more offended by it than I was. I'm like, you know what, let's just do it. I know what they mean, let's do it. And we did it. I'm not going to say it's the most pure song Savage Garden have ever written, but it's also not the most hooker-like song. It wasn't as if we had to. We still had a choice, and the choice that we made was to craft a really clever written pop song that had a romantic feel about it, which was how our original audience had been introduced to us from Truly Madly Deeply.
Crash and Burn is another one of those songs that were written in the period when Daniel and I were living in two separate nations, surrounded by I was surrounded by strangers, and I was very isolated. And, I look back now and I realize I was writing that song as a lullaby to myself. I wanted someone to say to me, call me before you crash. At the end of the day, when you feel like, you're gonna hit the ground, just call me. I'm going to be there for you. I don't know what Daniel was going for musically, but again, it's one of those songs that he presented as an instrumental, and it just touched me. I had this feeling, and he provided what it sounded like, and I recorded a song and sent it back to him. It sounds strange, but half of the second album was really written that way, and I guess necessarily I was finding it very difficult to connect to people, but I could do it in song. And it was very convenient that, we were, billions of miles away from each other, because I could let my guard down in the studio and say all the things that I wanted to say without having to explain them. If I'm honest, I was always petrified to sing Crash and Burn live because the verse at that time, my range is so much bigger now, but back then The verse was so low for me, and I hated how I sounded in the studio, and I was hypercritical of it. So live, I was always so concerned that I would hit the low notes. A lot of people get afraid of hitting the high notes. That was never a problem for me, but hitting those low baritone vibes was always a concern. It became, and it is to this day, it's a sunset in a show. You know, it's always that second to last song. It's a song that I need to hear at that point in the show. The audience wants to hear. It's anthemic. It has a stadium feel to it. Again, one of those wonderful talents, I think, that Daniel had for writing songs that the set list needed. You know, really thinking about what a show would want. I think having done a world tour with just one album of material and a few strange covers, we were both aware of what a show needed, and Crash and Burn is one of those. It's a stadium anthem.
Crash and Burn was a song that I think was used to rescue people. And its target really was, an adolescent, teenager, going through difficulties, not really understanding why they think the way they think, not really having a relationship that was very healthy with their parents or their friends, or isolation. And Darren lyrically did it amazingly with those words. And I think a lot of people have connected with that song and felt like they weren't on their own, they weren't alone. And Darren had that ability to do that in a few of our songs, and it was remarkable.
I love Affirmation so much. It was a stream of consciousness writing experience for both Daniel and I. An album that had begun on opposite sides of the globe with two very disconnected performers. It allowed us, when we thought that we'd finished writing the album, to then just experiment. And it began with a loop, a very, very fast trip-hop loop, and these cycling chords mirrored by a repetitive melody that kept spiraling upward. It's almost ritualistic or meditative pattern in song and music. And Affirmation is that. Lyrically, some of the most complicated lyrics in terms of the get your thesaurus out. And it was just this idea of just delivering a list of beliefs. Not all of them are things I agree with. They're just beliefs. Some of them are real, some of them are other people's, but that's what it was. And it's such a unique song. I mean, I'm so glad that we wrote it, and I've never performed a live show without that song. That song usually closes a show for me. It's incredibly powerful, and it asks questions that even to this day I change my mind about all the time. Really, I feel lucky to have walked into that song. I couldn't tell you where it came from. It just came out of the sky.
What it takes to be a good producer is someone that understands the big picture. And the big picture is, the reality is, you've got an artist, you've got a budget, you've got the tools, and you've got a deadline for when a song needs to be completed or an album needs to be completed. And anything else that you need to achieve that with those things, you've got to do it. So the nuts and bolts version of being a producer is you just have to actually get the job done. However, emotionally, spiritually, you need to invest in the art of it. And then you also have to be careful not to be taking away from the artists who you're producing the magic by replacing it with what you think your magic is. So it's a real balancing act, and you've got to literally have no ego sometimes to be a good producer, and you've got to know when and how to bring out the best of an artist, even if we are the artists.
Chain to You is a song about the first time I really kissed a man. It was in New York City at a nightclub called Splash, and he was my first boy love, and I'm smiling when I say this because it was one of the sweetest experiences of my life and very innocent. The lyrics are completely true. We were standing all alone, you were leaning in to speak to me, acting like a mover shaker, dancing to Madonna, then you kissed me. My favourite song at the time was Ray of Light by Madonna. And I was a public person risking all sorts of drama in the press and in my career by even going out to a gay bar. But I was desperate to find out if I could do this. I knew that I was gay. I just didn't know how to have a relationship. And I remember it was where I met my first ever boyfriend, was on that dance floor, and Chained to You is about him. It's an 80s throwback. I can't remember how the music came to be. I think, again, it was maybe a few chords and a drum beat that Daniel sent to me, but, it was just a great relationship, really fun, sweet, time in my life. And that's where my happiness started to come back. It's where I realized that I could love another human being and I could also love myself and not be ashamed about it. And I still love that song. Super fun.
Not consciously, no. That's ultimately what's going to define who the artist is, isn't it? Some artists are going to go a lot further towards one direction than another artist would, and that's what's ultimately going to create their influence. So no, I don't believe any artist has anything that's off limits. I think that's just where they're capable of going. There's a lot more creative artists than us out there that will take things a lot further than we ever would. It just defines who the artist is. Hopefully no artists really want to put limits on themselves. They just go where they need to go to get the result. It might change in 10 years' time, 20 years' time. I mean, I know Darren's writing different music nowadays to what he was when him and I were writing together. It's just where he is now, so it just defines who you are. I don't think it was ever easy, but nor was it ever hard. And hear me out. I think ultimately you've got to do what you do, be who you are, and if there's an audience out there that really appreciate it, they're going to let you know. But what you have to do is put yourself in front of that audience. I don't know if it's necessarily easier or harder nowadays than it was back then, but if there's something that's interesting or if there's an artist that you really like, you're going to embrace them, whether it's now or 20 years ago or 50 years ago. If you overthink that too much, and you'll all of a sudden, as an artist, you can start doing your own head in because you're thinking, well, why isn't this working for me? Maybe I should try this. Maybe I should try that. Maybe I should try this. Ultimately, you've got to do what you do and find an audience.
Affirmation as an album is a breakup album. It's a band breaking up. It's my marriage breaking up. It's me breaking up with celebrity, me breaking up with the previous version of my life, reluctantly walking into a future that I didn't know I even wanted, but trying to be a good man, really trying to be a good human being. And Hold Me is a song about a marriage breaking down. There's a lyric in there that says, "Isn't happiness worth more than a gold and diamond ring?"
Hold Me isn't overly complicated. It's the reality. It's 3 or 4 chords again, doing a pop progression. It really doesn't do much more than support the lyric and melody. There's a couple of nice minor over major changes in the middle 8 from memory. It's just about creating a nice foundation for some security, I guess. I remember it was very, very challenging to get the feel right on that particular song. It has it's a sort of a 102 beats per minute from memory, maybe a little lower. And it has a slight swing, slight shuffle to it. And I remember it was really, really difficult for us to get that feel right. We ultimately got it in the end, and it actually came from the acoustic guitar. The right hand of the acoustic guitar gave it this looseness and this feel that allowed it to swing better. So yeah, that was the memory I have from recording.
When I think about The Best Thing, I just get an excited feeling in my tummy because it's the opening of a tour. It's the second Savage Garden World Tour, and it's a song that I've recently started putting back into my set lists. It just reminds me of stadiums. It reminds me of, again, that feeling of about to walk out on stage and become him, become this alter ego, this superhero version of yourself. I think, again, it was a song that was written very intentionally from a musical point of view to have high energy, uplifting anthem moments, arena-like moments in our live set list. Lyrically, man, I guess I was talking about all of those relationships in my life where it shouldn't work, but it does, and whether that's Daniel and Darren or it was my romantic relationship I think I was in at the time. I was definitely attracted to that which would probably ultimately destroy me when it came to love. And there was a certain thrill in that. And I think that's what the best thing is about, It's about opposites working together. So when it came time to write the rest of the album, I knew what Walter was capable of in the studio. And so I was doing things that I knew that he would take to the next level. And I think the best thing is an example of that, where I wanted a choir of voices. I think going back, if I think of inspirations, Hall & Oates was a huge inspiration to me, and Faith by George Michael, the way George managed to use his voice in such a identifiable way. I've never had a backing singer on my records. 2 of them were credited on the first album, but they don't know I muted them at the mix because I was that egotistical. I didn't want them on there. I wanted to emulate people like Janet and Michael Jackson and Madonna, who usually lay it up. And Prince, actually, my God, Prince, huge influence on me. The first song I ever wrote was just me at home with 2 tape recorders layering up, 20, 30 of my voice to make it sound like a choir. So I guess it was something that was important to me in that song.
There's a song called Kiss the Dirt by In Excess. And then there was also a little bit of Devil Inside by In Excess. You can probably hear that in the riff. A couple of In Excess songs inspired me creatively to come up with the riffs of The Best Thing. The whole In Excess thing at that time was really a big part of my influence. And I think it's basically a happy song about saying, your better half, basically. Look, I think when we came to America to produce this particular record, we envisioned it being a little slick and produced and quite well put together on the production side of things. Having Walter there, who had worked with many brilliant vocalists, he gave us some tools to be able to put down some amazing harmonies, and Darren would do all his own harmonies and did them very, very, very well. So, yeah, it was really just a polished production. Nowadays, I probably wouldn't do as many vocals in it, but back then it definitely worked and gave it that sound that it's got.
I am a huge Kate Bush fan. I am lucky enough to have been influenced by her music my whole career, and I never thought I'd get to see her live, and it was an extraordinary moment recently to fly to London and see her first show in, something like 30 years. She continues to astound me, but I was always a fan of songs like This Woman's Work, piano ballads by Elton John. There's a Stevie Nicks song called Has Anyone Ever Written Anything For You? Daniel's position of power and choice and wonder was always the piano. I loved when he would sit down and play a riff just on a piano. And I remember that's what this song was. And also, it's really innocent from a production point of view. It was never finished, it was just a piano vocal, and one of those songs that were presented, I think, to Charles Fisher, but he just didn't think was right for the album, and he was correct. It was a more mature statement. Being gay, I relate a lot to the dismissal sometimes that women experience, how you're emasculated because you're feminine. I think that's what I was talking about on the song. It's hard to even imagine, but when I first heard it again after so long, I think I had the same feeling I had when I heard songs like Truly, Madly, Deeply. I thought, this is so intimate. I don't know if I want the world to hear this. This is the sound of someone thinking. And it's not perfect. We made a conscious decision that I don't want to make any more music. I don't want to release albums as a band before. Those days are gone. That time passed. There might have been a window 15 years ago maybe, but I made my peace with it and I moved on. And I think I felt very conflicted about even releasing this. But at the same time, I think enough time has passed that it's as much a thank you as anything. And I see it as like historical. It's an artifact. It's a snapshot of a band before they were famous, before they succeeded. To be honest, I'm surprised that it's not too bad.
Musically, from my point of view, if you recall the Wendy Matthews song, The Day You Went Away, musically, when I heard that song, it emotionally kind of grabbed me, and it was all about its simplicity and its fairly dark piano sound. And even though She is a very romantic, loving song, there was something dark inside of it that I kind of wanted to bring out with that piano. And I think the darkness is more just beauty in its innocence, if that makes sense. From memory, and we're going back a little bit now, from memory, I think we just sat down and literally wrote it together in the sense of, you know, an artist that plays the piano and sings is exactly what Darren and I combine to become. So he ultimately sits down and sings, I'm ultimately sitting down and playing the piano, and collectively we used to come up with something of what our history has been all about. So yeah, it basically started as the two of us writing something that we were both feeling at that time. The recording was done at my house in Brisbane, my parents' house actually. I was still living at home back then. I remember there was in Darren's vocal recording, there was my dog barking in the background and my brother coming home from work and, my dad driving in the driveway and, all this noise going on behind this beautiful recording of Darren's vocal. And unfortunately, you can't hear it in the final recording nowadays, but it's definitely there underneath the piano.